The Senate planned a new vote for Wednesday evening after the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah. But nothing in Washington stays simple. Secretary Paulson's original plan was about 3 pages long. The House legislation was 110 pages. The new Senate bill to be voted on was now over 450 pages. And there were new sweeteners, including greater federal deposit insurance protection of bank deposits and a patch for the alternative minimum tax. This time the plan passed by a lopsided margin, 74 to 25. But that was the Senate. It still had to pass the House. And it did on Friday. The bill passed easily, 263 to 171. President Bush wasted no time in signing it. A wild ride was over, but what would happen next? No one could say.
Coming up, the Great Depression. Suddenly, it's not just a chapter in your history book. How do we avoid another one? Many politicians and financial experts are warning we'll face another Great Depression if we aren't smart. But historians and economists are also learning new lessons about the Depression and how the government may have made things a lot worse. Can we learn from those mistakes?
We are square in the greatest financial crisis of our lifetimes.
We've gone through the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression.
One thing both presidential candidates agree on, if we don't watch out, we'll have a depression of our own. Could we go through another Great Depression?
Yes, we really could go through a depression if we repeated those missteps of the 1930s.
Amity Shlaes is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a well-known financial columnist and author of a highly respected new book on the Great Depression, The Forgotten Man.
Was there anything we can learn about the way, specifically the way FDR handled the Depression, that might help us through this crisis?
There's lots to learn, especially about how to wreck a recovery, David, because you want to recall that the Depression didn't end until World War II, and the market didn't come back till 1954. So today that would mean till 2033 the Dow wouldn't come back to where it was.
We're certainly nowhere close to the Great Depression today. During the Depression, unemployment hit a high of 25% and stayed there for years. It's 6.1% today. We've had some significant failures in the financial industry, but during the Depression, thousands of banks failed. But the big question is, what caused it all and what kept it going? The popular view of the Depression is that it was a failure of the capitalist system that started with a 1929 stock market crash and deepened when Republican President Herbert Hoover decided to do nothing, hoping the free market would sort itself out. The situation only improved, this view goes, when Democrat FDR came in, curbed out-of-control capitalism with regulation, and instituted a broad series of big government programs to rescue the needy. Shlaes is one of a growing number of economists, historians, and commentators who challenge this view based on new research. They say that government intervention itself helped to prolong and deepen the disaster.
When you look at FDR, what specifically did he do to either cause or prolong the Depression?
The first was taxation. They took more of the money through the period. It punished a business if it didn't pay out dividends or otherwise spend. Very important. When you raise taxes, you make the crash last longer as well.
And we know that from history because they tried it in FDR's time?
Oh, yes. You see people basically shutting down their business rather than pay those taxes.
Each time we have a new bailout, it asks for more money and more power for Washington.
When you're scared, you really do start to think with another part of your brain, and you really do look for strong figures. There's a lot of scaremongering going on. We're concerned about the bailout now, $700 billion. So is there another bailout tomorrow? That's what the American people are asking. The thing that we need to be afraid of is too big a government. If you look at the United States in the next 2 years and you say, what will help us recover? It won't be the government. You can't legislate recovery. It will be the markets, so the markets have to want to stay here.
And if, as Shlaes says, depending too much on the government to save us is dangerous, just as bad is to blame the wrong target.
This financial crisis is the direct result of greed and irresponsibility that has dominated Washington and Wall Street for years.
What's not a good role for government is to pillory rich people to satisfy crowds for a moment.
I'm afraid on Wall Street, greed is rewarded, excess is rewarded, and corruption, or certainly a failure to carry out our responsibility, is rewarded.
The hedge funds, the IPOs, those things that sound like they're bad, they do provide wealth across the country. They create jobs.
But you hear that rhetoric coming from both sides,
and you hear
from
that
both
rhetoric,
McCain and Obama.
You hear that from both sides.
Whether the bailout will work or not is still an open question. What seems beyond doubt is that its price tag will put a crimp in any expensive plans for the next president. Now, that may be a bigger challenge for President Obama than McCain. That's because McCain has spent his entire career fighting against wasteful government, and throughout the campaign has already been promising to cut spending if elected.
We can't dedicate possibly more than $1 trillion to rescue failing institutions and then go right back to business as usual in Washington. As president, I will impose a 1-year spending freeze on every agency of the federal government. Accepting only national defense, the care of our veterans, and a few critical priorities.
Obama, on the other hand, has talked about substantial new spending and hasn't identified what parts of his big plans he will cut back, if any.
Senator Obama, as president, as a result of whatever financial rescue plan comes about, and the $700 billion, whatever it is it's going to cost, what are you going to have to give up?
There's no doubt that we're not going to be able to do everything that I think needs to be done. There are some things that I think have to be done. We have to have energy independence. We have to fix our healthcare system. We've got to make sure that we're competing in education. We've got to invest in science and technology. We have to do is make sure that college is affordable for every young person in America. And I also think that we're going to have to rebuild our infrastructure. Also making sure that we have a new electricity grid to get the alternative energy to population centers that are using them.
The most important lesson of the mortgage meltdown may be this. Even though Wall Street greed played a big role, the bigger culprit is a desire of Washington to paper over the true cost of government obligations. Worse still is when the government pretends its obligations really belong to somebody else. When politicians claim Fannie Mae's questionable investments didn't put taxpayer money at risk, they were not facing up to reality, or they weren't telling you the truth. And now any candidate who doesn't acknowledge that this crisis is going to make a strong impact on what government can do in the future, well, they're not facing reality either. This election year, the candidates have all been promising change. There's no doubt now we really need it. Before Election Day, the voters must carefully examine the candidates' programs and promises and ask themselves anew, what does change in Washington really mean? And which candidates really stand for more of the same?